Mary Poppins Opens the Door by P.L. Travers. Chapter 1, the 5th of November. It was one of those bleak and chilly mornings that remind you winter is coming. Cherry Tree Lane was quiet and still. The mist hung over the park like a shadow. All the houses looked exactly alike as the gray fog wrapped them round. Admiral Boom's flagstaff, with the telescope at the top of it, had entirely disappeared. The milkman, as he turned into the lane, could hardly see his way. "Milk below!" he called outside the Admiral's door, and his voice sounded so queer and hollow that it gave him quite a fright. "I'll go home until the fog lifts," he said to himself. "Here, look where you're going," he went on, as a shape loomed suddenly out of the mist and bumped against his shoulder. "Bumble, bumble, bumble, rumble," said a gentle, muffled voice. "Oh, it's you," said the milkman with a sigh of relief. "Brumble," said the sweep again. He was holding his brushes in front of his face to keep his mustache dry. "Out early, aren't you?" the milkman said. The sweep gave a jerk of his black thumb toward Miss Lark's house. "Had to do the chimney before breakfast. Or had to do the chimney before the dogs had breakfast, in case the soot gave them a cough," he explained. The milkman laughed rudely, for that was what everybody did when Miss Lark's two dogs were mentioned. "Ha ha!" The mist was wreathing through the air. There was not a sound in the lane. "Ugh," said the milkman. "This quiet gives me the auras." And as he said that, the lane woke up. A sudden roar came from one of the houses, and the sound of stamping feet. "That's number 17, said the sweep. "Excuse me, old chap, I think I'm needed." He cautiously felt his way to the gate and went up the garden path. Inside the house, Mr. Banks was marching up and down, kicking the hall furniture. "I've had all that I can stand," he shouted, waving his arms wildly. "You keep on saying that," Mrs. Banks cried, "but you won't tell me what's the matter." She looked at Mr. Banks anxiously. "Everything's the matter," he roared. "Look at this." He waggled his right foot at her. "And this," he went on as he waggled his left. Mrs. Banks peered closely at the feet. She was rather short-sighted, and the hall was misty. I don't see anything wrong," she began timidly. "Of course you don't," he said sarcastically. "It's only imagination, of course. It makes me think Robertson A. has given me one black shoe and one brown." And again he waggled his feet. "Oh," said Mrs. Banks hurriedly, for now she saw clearly what the trouble was. "You may well say, 'oh,' so will Robertson A. when I give him the sack tonight." "It's not his fault, Daddy," cried Jane from the stairs. "He couldn't see because of the fog. Besides, he's not strong." "He's strong enough to make my life a misery," said Mr. Banks angrily. "He needs rest, Daddy," Michael reminded him, hurrying down after Jane. "He'll get it," promised Mr. Banks, as he snatched up his bag. "When I think of all the things I could have done if I hadn't gone and got married, lived alone in a cave, perhaps. Or I might have gone round the world." "And what would we have done then?" asked Michael. "You would have had to fend for yourselves. And serve you right, where's my overcoat?" "You have it on, George," said Mrs. Banks meekly. "Yes," he retorted, "and only one button. But anything's good enough for me. I'm only the man who pays the bills. I shall not be home for dinner." A wail of protest went up from the children. "But it's Guy Fawkes's day," wheedled Mrs. Banks. "And you're so good at letting off rockets." "No rockets for me," cried Mr. Banks. "Nothing but trouble from morning till night." He shook Mrs. Banks's hand from his arm and dashed out of the house. "Shake, sir," said the sweep in a friendly voice as Mr. Banks knocked into him. "It's lucky, you know, to shake hands with a sweep." "Away, away," said Mrs. Banks wildly. "This is not my lucky day," said Mr. Banks wildly. "Away, away," said Mr. Banks wildly. "This is not my lucky day." The sweep looked after him for a moment. Then he smiled to himself and rang the doorbell. "He doesn't mean it, Michael. He will still come home for fireworks." Jane and Michael rushed at Mr. Banks and Mrs. Banks and tugged at. "He doesn't mean it, Mother. He will come home for the fireworks." Jane and Michael rushed at Mrs. Banks and tugged at her skirt. "Oh, I can't promise anything, children," she sighed as she looked at her face in the front hall mirror. And she thought to herself, "Yes, I'm getting thinner. One of my dimples is gone already, and soon I shall lose the second. No one will look at me any more, and it's all her fault. By her, Mrs. Banks meant Mary Poppins, who had been the children's nurse. As long as Mary Poppins was in the house, everything had gone smoothly, but since the day when she had left them so suddenly, and without a word of warning, the family had gone from bad to worse. Here I am, thought Mrs. Banks miserably, with 5 wild children, and no one to help me. I've advertised, I've asked my friends, but nothing seems to happen, and George is getting crosser and crosser, and Annabel's teething, and Jane and Michael and the twins are so naughty, not to mention the awful income tax. She watched a tear run over the spot where the dimple had once been. It's no good, she said with sudden decision. I shall have to send for Miss Andrew. A cry went up from all 4 children. Away in the nursery, Annabel screamed, for Miss Andrew had once been their father's governess, and they knew how frightful she was. I won't speak to her, shouted Jane in a rage. I'll spit on her shoes if she comes, threatened Michael. No, no, wailed John and Barbara miserably. Mrs. Banks clapped her hands to her ears. Children, have mercy! She cried in despair. Beg pardon, ma'am, said Ellen, the housemaid, as she tapped Mrs. Banks on the shoulder. The sweep is here for the drawing-room chimbley. But I warn you, ma'am, it's my day out, and I can't clean up after him, so there, she blew her nose with a trumpeting sound. Excuse me, said the sweep cheerfully, as he dragged in his bags and brushes. Who's that? Came the voice of Mrs. Brill as she hurried up from the kitchen. The sweep? On baking day? No, you don't. I'm sorry to give you notice, ma'am, but if that Hottentot goes into the chimney, I shall go out the door. Mrs. Banks glanced round desperately. I didn't ask him to come, she declared. I don't know if the chimney wants sweeping. A chimbley's always glad for a brush. The sweep stepped calmly into the drawing-room and began to spread out his sheet. Mrs. Banks looked nervously at Mrs. Brill. Perhaps Robertson A. could help? Robertson is asleep in the pantry, wrapped in your best lace shawl, and nothing will wake him, said Mrs. Brill. But the sound of the last trombone, so if you please, I'll be packing my bag. Ow, let me go, you Hindu! For the sweep had seized Mrs. Brill's hand and was shaking it vigorously. A reluctant smile spread over her face. Well, just this once, she remarked cheerfully, and she went down the kitchen stairs. The sweep turned to Ellen with a grin. Don't touch me, you black heathen, she screamed. I'm sorry, I did not remember that this stuff was in this book, in a terrified voice. But he took her hand with a firm grip, and she too began to smile. Well, no messing up the carpet, she warned him, and hurried off to her work. Shake, said the sweep as he turned to the children. It's sure to bring you luck. He left a black mark on each of their palms, and they all felt suddenly better. Then he put out his hand to Mrs. Banks, and as she took his warm black fingers, her courage came flowing back. We must make the best of things, darling, she said. I shall advertise for another nurse, and perhaps something good will happen. Jane and Michael sighed with relief. At least she was not going to send for Miss Andrew. What do you do when you need luck? Asked Jane as she followed the sweep into the drawing-room. Oh, I just shake hands with myself, he said cheerfully, pushing his brush up the chimney. All day long the children watched him and argued over who should hand him his brushes. Now and again Mrs. Banks came in to complain of the noise and to hurry the sweep. And all day long, beyond the windows, the mist crept through the lane. Every sound was muffled, the birds were gone, except for an old and mottled starling who kept on peering through the cracks in the blinds, as if he were looking for someone. At last the sweep crept out of the chimney and smiled at his handiwork. So kind of you, said Mrs. Banks hurriedly. Now I'm sure you must want to pack up and go home. I'm in no hurry, remarked the sweep. Me tea isn't ready till 6 o'clock, and I've got an hour to fill in. Well, you can't fill it in here, Mrs. Banks shrieked. I have to tidy up this room before my husband comes home. I tell you what, the sweep said calmly, if you've got a rocket or two about you, I could take them children into the park and show 'em a few fireworks. I'd give you a rest and myself a treat. I've always been very partial to rockets ever since a boy. And before. A yell of delight went up from the children. Michael ran to a window and lifted the blind. Oh, look what's happened, he cried in triumph, for a change had come to Cherry Tree Lane. The chill gray mist had cleared away. The houses were lit with warm, soft lights, and away in the west shone a glimmer of sunset, rosy and clear and bright. "Remember your coats!" cried Mrs. Bank as the children darted away. Then she ran to the cupboard under the staircase and brought out a knobbly parcel. "Here you are," she said breathlessly to the sweep, "and mind be careful of Sparks." "Sparks?" said the sweep. "Why, Sparks is my hobby. Them and the soot what comes after." The children leapt like puppies about him. As he went down the garden path, Mrs. Banks sat down for 2 minutes' rest on one of the sheet-covered chairs. The starling looked in at her for a moment. Then he shook his head disappointedly and flew away again. Daylight was fading as they crossed the road. By the park railings, Bert, the matchman, was spreading out his tray. He lit a candle with one of his matches and began to draw pictures on the pavement. He nodded gaily at the children as they hurried through the gates. "Now all we need," the sweep said fussily, "is a clear patch of grass." "Which you won't get," said a voice behind them. "The park is closed at 5:30. And out of the shadows came the park keeper, looking very belligerent. "But it's Guy Fawkes Day, the 5th of November, the children answered quickly. "Orders is orders," he retorted, "and all days are alike to me." "Well, where can we let off our fireworks?" Michael demanded impatiently. A greedy look leapt into the keeper's eyes. "You got some fireworks?" he said hungrily. "Well, why not say so before?" And he snatched the parcel from the sweep and began to untie the string. "Matches, that's what we need," he went on, panting with excitement. "Here," said the matchman's quiet voice. He had followed the children into the park and was standing behind them with his lighted candle. The park keeper opened a bundle of squibs. "They're ours, you know," Michael reminded him. "Ah, let me help you do," said the keeper. "I've never had fun on Guy Fawkes Day, never since I was a boy." And without waiting for permission, he lit the squibs at the matchman's candle. The hissing streams of fire poured out, and pop, pop, pop went the crackers. The park keeper seized the Catherine wheel and stuck it on a branch. The rings of light began to turn and sparkled in the air, and after that he was so excited that nothing could stop him. He went on lighting fuse after fuse, as though he had gone mad. Flower pots streamed from the dewy grass, and golden rain flowed down through the darkness. Top hats burned for a bright, short moment. Balloons went floating by up to the branches, and fire snakes writhed in the shadows. The children jumped and squeaked and shouted. The park keeper ran about among them like a large frenzied dog, and amid the noise and the sparkling lights the matchman waited quietly. The flame of his candle never wavered as they lit their fuses from it. "Now!" cried the keeper, who was hoarse with shouting. "Now we come to the rockets!" All the other fireworks had gone. Nothing remained in the knobbly parcel except 3 long black sticks. "No, you don't," said the sweep as the keeper snatched them. "Share and share, that's fair." He gave the keeper 1 rocket and kept the others for himself and the children. Make way," said the keeper importantly, as he lit the fuse at the candle flame and stuck the stick in the ground. Hissing and guttering, the spark ran down like a little golden thread. Then whoop went the stick as it shot away. Up in the sky, the children heard a small, faraway bang, and a swirl of red and blue stars broke out and rained upon the park. "Oh!" cried the children, and "Oh!" cried the sweep. And that is the only word anyone can say when a rocket's stars break out. Then it was the sweep's turn. The candlelight gleamed on his black face as he lit the fuse with his rocket. Then came a whoop and another bang, and white and green stars spread over the sky like the ribs of a bright umbrella, and again the watchers all cried, "Oh!" and sighed for sheer joy. "It's our turn now," cried Jane and Michael, and their fingers trembled as they lit the fuse. They pressed the stick down into the earth and stepped back to watch. The thread of golden fire ran down. Whew! Up went the stick with the singing sound, up to the very top of the sky, and Jane and Michael held their breath as they waited for it to burst. At last, far away and very faint, they heard the little bang. Now for the stars, they thought to themselves, but alas, nothing happened. And we'll pause there.